Welcome back to Stem Cells from the Sofa, a virtual seminar series hosted by Stem Cell Network that is designed to reconnect researchers and bring expert content directly to your sofa. My name is John Draper and I am the Program Director for Research and Partnerships at the Stem Cell Network, and I'm extremely excited to be joined today by Dr. Bartha Knoppers, who has made huge contributions over her career in the development of international governance structures within health research that assist in championing research integrity, as well as preserving and respecting the rights of research participants, patients, and donors. Before Bartha shares her work, I'm just going to make sure that you're aware that you can ask questions, and it's fantastic when we have the audience participate. So please do ask questions, and you can ask questions at any point by clicking on the Q&A button in your window, and a little window will pop up for Q&A questions to be entered. Do this at any point during Bartha's talk, and by the end we will gather all those questions together and we'll have a little bit of a Q&A session, and I'll put those questions to Bartha. So it's very good to introduce Bartha. So Bartha Knoppers, PhD, is a full professor, Canada Research Chair in Law and Medicine, and Director of the Center of Genomics and Policy of the Faculty of Medicine at McGill University. Bartha is Chair of the Ethics and Governance Committee of the International Cancer Genome Consortium, as well as the Ethics Advisory Panel of WADA. She is co-chair of the Regulatory and Ethics Workstream of the Global Alliance for Genomics and Health. In 2015 to 2016, she was a member of the drafting group of the recommendations of the OECD Council on Health Data Governance and gave the Golden Lecture in November 2017. She holds 4 doctorates on honoris causa and is a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Hastings Center Bioethics, and the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences, and also a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. She is also an officer of the Order of Canada and of Quebec, and was awarded the 2019 Henry G. Friesen International Prize in Health Research. Bartha has a substantive publication list, has made, as I mentioned, extensive contributions to this field. And in her talk today, Bartha will cover the background and issue associated with gene editing and human rights. So Bartha, welcome. Thank you for joining us. Can you see that okay, Bartha?
Yes, I can. Thank you, John. And you could put the first slide on. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Seems rather strange in the time of confinement and COVID to be talking about gene editing, some sort of esoteric topic in the middle of a pandemic. Nevertheless, while we're all struggling to decide as a society, both internationally and nationally, what to do or not to do and how to move forward in the public interest, gene editing and gene editing science is moving forward. And I hope in my presentation today to take a kind of a different approach than the usual, there should be a law against it, or malpractice and whatever, and concentrate on some of the human rights aspects. And I'd like to thank my co-author, Erica Klarderman, for helping me in preparing this presentation. Next slide. Everyone, next slide, John. Everyone will remember the CRISPR babies. That term is ridiculous. We all remember that when Louise Brown was born in 1978, she was called a test tube baby. And the same kind of labeling seems to be going on with respect to the 2 children born in China at the end of 2018. So the CRISPR baby scandal, could I have the next slide, John? Well, I'll continue. It's just the birth of 2 children in China, supposedly following the use of the CRISPR technology, led to an immediate uproar, particularly because the scientist in question chose to present his success in having successfully implanted two gene-edited embryos followed by the birth of two children at the International Summit in Hong Kong. And this created an immediate reaction both in the scientific, but also from various governments and so on around the world. Next slide. Thank you. So one of the first to come out, this happened at the end of 2018, was the article in Nature calling for a moratorium. And the authors of this article were an elite, if I can say that, group of scientists and ethicists and so on, saying, we need an international framework. And countries can do and make their own decisions, but we need them to voluntarily commit to not approving any use of clinical germline editing. So we're talking clinical germline editing here until certain conditions are met, and those conditions were to be developed. So they sort of wanted a voluntary moratorium, as had occurred in the United States at the time, back in the 70s with DNA technologies. Next slide. And this was closely followed by a letter, again, this time published, but also sent to the Secretary of the US Department of Health and Human Services a bit later, again saying, oh, we need a moratorium, but this time a binding one, limiting clinical testing in humans, as well as effective and easily mechanisms for reporting, so whistleblowing. Yet if you read the letter, most of it actually says, look, don't touch somatic gene therapies, i.e. non-heritable therapies, therapies that look at correcting a gene in a particular individual, but will not be passed on to the next generation, as is the case with germline. So warning politicians who wanted to take immediate action on the need to distinguish between germline and somatic. Next slide. Now, as I mentioned in my introduction, everybody always says, oh, you need a law, you need a law. Where is everybody? Well, between the birth of two monkeys in 2015, so there were animal clinical, quotes, studies in germline, successful ones resulting in the birth of monkeys in China, that in 2015 had already led to 61 ethics reports and statements by more than 50 countries and organizations, and all found in this wonderful article, which you can see at the bottom of the screen. And amongst all those reports, if you go through them, 11 of them were open to the possibility of clinical applications of heritable genome editing under certain conditions. And these reports crossed a span of different professional societies, organizations, and so on. And having read through these reports, there were four sort of like leitmotif, or four themes that kept coming back all the time. The first, obviously, the specter of eugenics that germline editing would raise. The second, how far can parents go in making these decisions, usually in the context of in vitro fertilization, fertility / genetic conditions in the clinical setting. And how could even these monkeys, and now 3 years later, these two children be born? What happened to professional self-regulation, which is usually what is recommended, that scientists themselves anticipate the need for practice guidelines, principled approaches, and so on. And interesting enough, one of the other four themes coming from these reports was that if ever there was to be a case of a child being born from germline, that it risked, in quotes, a chilling effect on research. And you can see that already in that moratorium slide, where everybody said, whoa, how did we get here? What's happening? Let's stop everything, and so on. Next slide. So when we come to there must be a law against it kind of reaction, immediate reaction, a study that I undertook with two other authors published in 2016 showed that there isn't a vacuum. People always say there's a vacuum, a legal vacuum, because if you put together the different approaches from different countries, even pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, for example, which would be a precursor to implanting any embryo, edited embryo, in terms of testing to see whether the embryo still contained the deleterious gene. We can see that there have been approaches in different countries, most of them allowing PGD, as it's called. We see an almost universal prohibition on human research cloning, mixed approach to embryonic stem cell research, and so on. But we see in the top left corner quite a restrictive approach, or at a minimum regulated approach, or what we call the intermediate approach, as concerns human germline modification, with the exception of China. Now, China was not a legal vacuum. It had regulations and it had ethics approvals that were required, that were not met in the particular case of the birth of these two children. So you can really put all these approaches together and see that it's not a legal vacuum. Next slide. So let's move away then. Why would even talk about human rights? It's not sort of a nebulous stuff, you know, the kind of things you hear in presidential addresses or the opening of parliament and so on. Well, it's my contention that we've underestimated what we can do with existing, approved, ratified, signed human rights that are actionable and that should be framing the international debate, which then can influence, or at the same time, national positions. Next slide. So I'd like to start with the right to health. Next slide. In terms of an actual official, if I can put it that way, expression of the right to health was the International Covenant. Now, covenants are international treaties that take about 10 years. That's why that called for a binding moratorium. I thought, oh my goodness, it's going to take 10 years. They take that much time for the countries to develop them together at the UN, and then to sign, countries have to sign and ratify to bind themselves to making those rights actionable in their country. So we see Article 12.1 recognize this right to the highest attainable standard of physical. So note the word attainable. This means, given the country in question, it has to be reasonable to claim that your right to health or has not been respected in your country. It's going to be contextual, depend on social demographic, depend on your healthcare system, and obviously depends on what is available medically and scientifically at a given point in time. Next slide. Now, the Convention of the Rights of the Child, again, a convention that took 10 years and probably has the most signatories and ratifiers of any convention in the history of the UN. There's only one country that hasn't ratified it yet. Does talk about, first of all, no matter what rights you say children have, it has to be interpreted in their best interests or as a primary consideration. And states should listen to children. It's not because you're legally not an adult that you don't have a right to be involved, and particularly in research, let's say, or in even in just somatic gene therapy affecting you now, if you're a child with cystic fibrosis or another condition. So do wait according to their ability to take part. And you find this again, the highest attainable standard of health. Now you have to be clear, no one, no person, no child has the right to be born healthy. You can imagine what such a right would do to the reproductive freedoms of women. You can imagine the strain it would put on a system to say, I have a right to have access or be treated with somatic gene therapy and so on. But it definitely is a voice that we need to take into account. Next slide. So this is the most dormant right of all times till about maybe 20 years ago, which is not a long time in the evolution of human rights. First of all, next slide. Everyone is well aware of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. And you can see that everyone has the right to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. And I must say, I took international law as a law student. I can't even remember I saw the declaration, but no one drew my attention to this right to share in scientific advancement and its benefits. So I know this right also includes certain freedoms, and it has another article that says even if you have a right to share, the IP, intellectual property, and so on is still a possibility. But so it's the right of recognition I'm talking about, not the right of attribution today. Next slide. So a declaration is not a covenant. So this right was transformed in 1966 into something that is legally actionable. And if you look at Article 4, you can see that this right is only subject to limitations determined by law, insofar as such limitations are compatible with the nature of rights and for the purpose of promoting the general welfare in a democratic society. So it's slightly reworded this right under Article 15, calling it progress rather than scientific advancement, and calling it applications rather than benefits, but the idea is the same, and it has been signed and ratified by a great number of countries. Next slide. But as I mentioned, it's being called a dormant right, a sleeping beauty right. And it wasn't really till, except for, law professors and others, it wasn't really till 2009 that UNESCO's Venice statement started looking at this. And people had been looking at the cultural aspects, but not so much at clarifying the normative content of such a right and how to enhance the implementation. And that really started the ball rolling. And I can't go into all the AAAS, the American Association for Advancement of Science, did a poll of all its members across all disciplines. And in particular, UNESCO's recommendation of 2017 on science and scientific researchers recognized, this is interesting, the significant value of science as a common good. So that's something that, again, that hadn't been in the parlance, if you like, of human rights talk as relates to science. And OECD, same year, that access to and sharing and processing data can serve health-related public interests, and thus bring benefits. And finally, it's no longer a draft. As of a few weeks ago, the Committee of the United Nations did a general comment on science recently. It's very long. It doesn't really, it talks about all that science encompasses, but it doesn't really give any political depth, if you like, with what I was hoping for to this right. But I wanted to at least say that all countries have to report to the United Nations on how they have respected the rights that are signed and ratified. So individuals, collectivities, and so on can write to the governments, who are then obliged to report to United Nations on their respect. Next slide. So finally, one was a dormant right. This one is totally neglected and probably the best suited, I'm not sure best suited, but would make a nice trio, if you like, on the rights of future generations. Next slide. Now, the rights of future generations in relation to genetics, because normally most documents, statements, declarations around this right of future generations are on the environment. So for climate change and so on, it's a very important right. But we could see in the 1980s that was this right. They started talking about respect for the genetic heritage of mankind shall not be interfered with. So the future of mankind, so for clearly scientific and preventive or therapeutic purposes. And this static notion of genetic heritage of your code, of the code for humans, led to an interpretation when we started doing the big map of human sequences of what we call genetic exceptionalism, or an immutable, the notion that genes are static. You've got your set, you're born with it. Human genes are this, mouse genes are that, and so on. And that has really influenced legislation. Next slide. So the UNESCO's Universal Declaration on the Genome and Human Rights did not prohibit, in fact, germline editing. In fact, the principles made a very, or the committee, International Bioethics Committee, made a deliberate decision to not start naming different technologies so that the declaration would have interpretive value over time and not be seen as addressing only one technology. But if you look at Oviedo, if you look at the other declaration from UNESCO in the same year, 1997, you can see the language of descendants and of future generations, not impairing by gene editing the preservation of the human species or the genome of any descendants, and so on. And finally, in 2005, similarly, the Declaration on Bioethics, the impact of life sciences on future generations, including on their genetic constitution. So you can see politically how genes and human genes are seen, and why heritable germline editing is of major concern. Next slide. Recently, besides these issues of non-manipulation, genetic heritage, preserving the gene as it is for future generations, and so on, there has been a slight opening towards at least being able to do research on clinical aspects of gene editing. And I've just taken two new issues raised, for instance, by the Nuffield Council on Bioethics, that we need to think about the impact if we do this, if we do move to the clinic, about transgenerationalism, the ongoing monitoring of children, for instance, that would be necessary, the intergenerational monitoring. And what does that mean? And can we impose it? And what about the freedoms of children, and so on? And what are our obligations to future generations, our responsibility? And Quebec itself, here in Canada in 2019, because in Canada, as you know, we have a prohibition on research involving human embryos, and in particular, any modification thereof and no implantation thereof, did say that we should take appropriate measures and mechanisms. It's not that the criminal code in Canada cannot change, but if we were to do that, we should be very cautious and have stringent scientific standards, limit potential clinical applications to very serious, high penetrance, last resort, no other choice for the couple, electronic register for longitudinal medical monitoring, and so on. Next slide. So where are we going with this? Next slide. A few closing slides. Well, China has started working on new regulations. They've saying that such clinical research and one-day applications, if it did take place, should be only for high-risk cases, require approvals, more oversight. Next slide. The WHO has set up an expert advisory committee on global standards for governance and oversight, and they've already announced that they would like a global registry to who's doing what where, so we're not surprised every time that someone in Russia says we should do this, or I'm going to do it, or someone in China says I've done it. Next slide. And at the same time, next slide. At the same time, there's also a new international commission of the different academies looking at the possible scientific framework or conditions needed for potential clinical applications of human germline genome editing. And it's been tasked with identifying a number of scientific, medical, and ethical requirements to inform the development of a responsible pathway from research to clinical, if ever a given society concludes that heritable human genome editing applications are acceptable. Next slide. So in conclusion, I would argue that an arbitrary moratorium, first of all, it hasn't ever worked internationally. It may work in given countries that have a consensus or common value system, but an arbitrary moratorium does not further or foster the best interests of children or the rights of future generations, etc. Because they create an illusion of control, and they can really, people say, oh good, there's a moratorium. Now what's our next issue of concern? And they tend to silence what could be a vigorous ongoing debate and in how to actually maybe have an international prohibition, but maybe also, or not, instead have a responsible pathway. And it would be paradoxical to say we need prohibitions because they already exist. Most countries have legal prohibitions on germline editing, and only 8 countries actually allow the creation of embryos for research. So you can see that we're in a limited situation here in terms of germline editing. So unwittingly, creating a moratorium actually would undermine the need for, next slide, for more debate and for more discussion. And I would argue that a more realistic route would be to enforce what is out there, the regulations, the guidelines, the prohibitions, and so on, but have more dialogue, and not just a WHO commission and an international scientific commission, but rather have national authorities spend their time and resources and beginning to look in their own, within their own boundaries on the future of this technology. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bartha. That's really great. If the audience have any questions, please do start and entering them now into the Q&A box. I guess I can start with a couple of questions here. And one of them was, I mean, if one looks historically back at new technologies as they arose, like IVF and organ transplant, they were traditionally poorly accepted by, or very warily accepted by the press and the public. And then they became seen as essential technologies that have really changed the landscape of health and fertility. So do you see that there is a situation where that could arise for gene editing in the future?
Yes, I think so. I mean, that's the normal trajectory from, it's almost like the stages of death, you know, where there's, you know, anger, rejection, revolt, and then slowly comprehension, acceptance, and so on. It's as you said, for transplantation, for in vitro fertilization, those were the pathways, and we can name other controversial scientific and medical interventions. I think it will go this route. However, there are, in parallel to germline modification, there are pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. How many cases would there be where you could not, if you were a couple who absolutely insisted that you wanted your own, in quotes, biologic, genetically related children, how many couples would you have who would not be able, through pre-implantation, achieve that goal? I think from what we've been seeing, because I am a member of the International Commission of the Scientific Academies that's working on it, every day I should tell you, it's overwhelming. The numbers overall would be quite small for couples who would actually need access to these technologies. So the numbers are small, but the issues are great. So, yeah.
Interesting. So I was struck by the comment that you made about there was no right to be born healthy. That's a really interesting, I'd never appreciated that. But I guess one of the questions I have, are you aware of precedents for children seeking some kind of legal redress for decisions their parents made during the conception or given the technologies we already have, has that occurred? And is this something that we could see with the children that were born out of the experiment, the Chinese gene editing experiment?
I don't know how the Chinese children will react, but John, you know, in the 1990s, when prenatal diagnosis became more readily available, when sterilization procedures asked for by women to limit the number of children and so on became available, there were lawsuits, even here in Canada, particularly in the United States, but in France and the UK and in Germany and so on, that where children, well, first of all, the parents would say, you didn't do the right test, or you did the test right, but you interpreted it wrongly. So that's what we would call sort of a genetic malpractice. And
Right.
if you can say that to a orthopedic surgeon that you know, he or she didn't do a good professional job, why wouldn't such a wrongful birth legal case against a physician go ahead? And over time, the courts were able to distinguish where there really was malpractice. And so the parents were saying, we only want to be compensated for the extra, and the courts did that in most cases, the extra cost of bringing up a handicapped child that, but for your negligence, would have been born healthy. Mm-hmm. Those cases took time, but the wrongful life cases, however, brought by the children saying that, but for your negligence, I never would have been born, have not been accepted. Courts have simply said we cannot look at the value of non-existence versus handicapped existence. I don't know how some of these judges actually wrote the judgments. They're quite amazing to read. But when that started happening, that children had no recourse, which means that whatever funds their parents got to take care of them stopped at age 18 when they're adults. The children were suing for funds to take care of them from legal capacity, 18, let's say, to their death. And the funds to parents for their own rights only ended at age 18. So some countries finally said, look, there's no suing for wrongful life. But like for vaccine, there's a Vaccine Damages Payments Act in quite a few countries where you could show that there has been a mistake or in case of vaccines, an adverse reaction that's 1 in 1 million, and there would be compensation by the state through the normal social services health in terms of taking on the cost of caring for the child. So the wrongful life was stopped because otherwise they were scared of children suing their mothers as well for negligent behavior during pregnancy, or for not having prenatal, or for not having aborted, or would sue the doctor for the outcome of their handicapped, in quotes, existence. It's really, you can make a movie. It's so incredible.
I think there was also the case with thalidomide.
Yes.
Well, that was notable, especially in Europe for, I get there's a question coming in. So what are the hopes of actually getting universal enforcement of any recommendations and guidelines and indeed laws, you know?
Yeah.
So I mean, international legal enforcement.
Well, I'm an idealist still. I find that legal prohibitions, and particularly criminal prohibitions with respect to medical interventions should be a last resort. Something has to be so morally reprehensible. Let's take a human reproductive cloning, for instance. There might be interventions that do gather that kind of consensus. Would an international agreement of some sort would definitely have a preventive effect. In this case, I'm not so sure that saying that you cannot do research on clinical germline modifications is the way to go. I do think professional societies in general, if they do put out guidelines, which they should, and update them, that's considered the standard of care. Mm-hmm. And the standard of care is a criterion that you can use when judging the actions of a legal criterion you can use when studying the actions of a researcher.
Fantastic. Do we have any more questions from the audience? If you wish to write a question, do it now. Otherwise, I will thank you, Bartha, for a fantastic talk there. Very interesting. Still a lot of work to be done by the sounds of it, and it sounds like you're pressing on every day to do that. So thank you for your efforts. We have a Stem Cells from the Sofa upcoming with Anil Dilawari. Anil is the Managing Director of Save It Like Sully, and on Wednesday, August 12th at 1 p.m, you'll be able to join Anil for a coaching presentation about how to do effective distant communications for science professionals. And so now that remote working is the norm for many, effective communication, be it for presentations or meetings on distance communication platforms like Zoom, are more important than ever. Be sure to register and level up your communication skill sets. So as always, you can get more information about Stem Cells from the Sofa talks from our website, stemcellnetwork.ca, or you can follow us on Twitter and see the updates there as well. In the meantime, I want to thank Bartha. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a good day.